Aloha everyone, and welcome to this lecture where we are going to be covering Chapter 1A, or in other words, the first part of Chapter 1. This first chapter in your text really serves as your orientation to the human body, and we are going to be covering some different anatomical terms in this chapter. So in this chapter, what we're going to be doing is looking at what exactly anatomy and physiology are, so what's their definitions, and how are they connected to one another as well as different from one another. So this slide covers the outline for today's lecture. We're going to begin by discussing the key questions and then learning outcomes for Chapter 1A. Then we will have, of course, this lecture to talk about the content that is covered in the first part of Chapter 1. And then we will end by going over some of the information you need to complete the second part of the homeostasis activity. So I suggested in that end of that intro lecture that you try to complete homeostasis activity part 1. If you haven't done that yet, that's okay. Try to do that as soon as possible, and then we also have a homeostasis part 2 activity to complete this week as well. So this is the plan for today. Let's go ahead and get started. I told you that we're going to kind of begin by looking at the key questions. So there are two major key questions that we are going to cover today. The first is, what is the key idea of anatomy and physiology? And the second is, what are the requirements of life? What does it take to live? And how does our body maintain a healthy set point? In other words, how do we have homeostasis, which again is a word we'll be talking about a lot today. In terms of our learning outcomes for Chapter 1A lecture, first we want to define the terms anatomy and physiology. So we're in anatomy and physiology. What exactly are those things? Secondly, give specific examples to show that kind of interrelationship between anatomy and physiology. Why did we combine them into the same course? Why don't we just have anatomy and physiology like some universities have? Why are they combined? Third, describe in order from the simplest to the most complex the major levels of organization in the human organism. Fourth, give an example of each of these levels of organization. Fifth, list the organ systems of the human body and their major components. And sixth, describe the major functions of each organ system. So let's go ahead and let's get started with these learning outcomes by learning more about the terms anatomy and physiology. Now that we've covered those key questions and our learning outcomes, let's go ahead and get started with today's lecture. So the term anatomy is the study of the structure of body parts and the relationship to one another. The key word that I'd really point out here is that it is the structure. The word anatomy is actually derived from Greek, and it means to cut or cutting backwards. So in other words, putting things together from slices. In order to really study anatomy, you have to know anatomical terminology and be able to do things like observe and manipulate and palpate, which palpate just means to feel organs with your hands, and to oscillate, which just means to listen to the organ sounds using a stethoscope. Anatomy, oftentimes I've found, is easier for students to grasp and understand because you can actually see and examine different body parts. There are several different types of anatomy. So in other words, it's broken up into kind of different branches. And anatomy is really a broad field with, like I said, multiple subdivisions, which we're going to discuss on the following slides. As I mentioned, there are different types of anatomy, and we can investigate anatomy with what we see with our unaided eye, and that is what we term gross or macroscopic anatomy. So macro meaning large, right? Gross or macroscopic anatomy is the study of very large visible structures. So if, say, you were to cut open a human torso, and I'd be able to then, if I cut that open, I'd be able to look at the stomach. And what I might see is kind of this yellowish, clumpish fat that's around it called the omentum. And then I could peel off that outside layer and see the layers of things like muscles, and I could cut even deeper to the inside. I'd be able to feel the rugae or those ridges of your stomach if the stomach were empty. So that is gross anatomy, what you can actually see with your eye. But that's all you can see, right? With gross anatomy is what your eyes are capable of seeing. If I wanted to see the tiniest parts of the stomach, if I wanted to see the different glands, the cells, etc., I would need to cut a piece of that stomach out, put it underneath a high-powered microscope to view more. So when you need special equipment to see the anatomy, that is what we term microscopic anatomy. Microscopic anatomy deals with structures that are too small to be seen by the naked eye. There are a couple different types of microscopic anatomy that you might have heard of. First of all, we have cytology. Cytology is the study of cells. And we also have histology, which is the study of tissues. Another type of anatomy is developmental anatomy. And this is the field of embryology that is concerned with the changes that things like your cells, tissues, organs, and the body as a whole undergoes when it starts as a germ cell of each parent to the resulting offspring. And that includes both prenatal, so in the womb, development, as well as postnatal development. Embryology is actually a subdivision of developmental anatomy, and that focuses on development before birth. So that's how we know where exactly we should be at a certain age. So you can see here the Tanner stages of development, the different stages, and for female, male, and both sexes, just kind of the different stages of development there. And right here, you're just seeing that development from the very beginning, right? Fertilization all the way through day 23 here. So again, that is developmental anatomy. Sometimes people confuse it and they think developmental anatomy is mostly just like development of the fetus. It's actually both prenatal as well as postnatal. Now that we have discussed what anatomy is and some of the different aspects of anatomy, we're going to move on to looking at what exactly physiology is, and then how anatomy and physiology are connected. Physiology often focuses on events at the cellular or the molecular level. So in order to actually study physiology, you have to understand basic physical principles, things like electrical currents, pressure, and movement, as well as basic chemical principles. So we kind of take other branches of science. It's not just biology in order to understand physiology. We also need some physics as well as some chemistry. So physiology is the study of the function of the body parts. So just like anatomy was the structure, physiology is the function. So those are, if you pick one word out of each definition, anatomy is the structure, physiology is the function. This is based on organ systems, and it is how the body's abilities are dependent on chemical reactions in individual cells. And again, we need both physical and chemical principles in order to understand physiology. So I told you before that oftentimes anatomy is easier for students to grasp because they can actually see the different body parts. Well, physiology sometimes is harder for students to understand because we can't see these things happening, right? If you eat a sandwich right now, you can't see your body digesting that, right? You just see the end result, right? So it's a lot harder sometimes to understand physiology, but it's still obviously equally important, right? We need to understand the anatomy, that structure, along with the physiology or the function. Essentially, if you really break it down, physiology is studying how the parts of the body function to keep it alive. Now that we have defined anatomy and we've defined physiology, I want to take a look at the overlap between the two. And a Venn diagram, which is what you see here, is a great way to connect two different things and to see what they have in common and also to see what is different about them. So again, anatomy over here, this is going to be the study of the structure of the human body. We are able to view anatomy by dissection, by observing, by manipulating, by palpating. We're able to see the size, the location, the relative location of a structure to another structure. We have different types of anatomy, like I mentioned. There is gross anatomy, there's also microscopic views of anatomy, there's developmental anatomy. So to study anatomy, as I said, you have to know anatomical terminology. And physiology, on the other hand over here, this is the study of how the body structures function. So we have to bring into play chemical processes as well as physical processes and mechanical processes within the body. We look at specific functions within an organ system and then also how those different organ systems are interacting with one another. When we look at, okay, what exactly do they share? What do they have in common? Anatomy must be known in order for physiology to be understood. So, in other words, they are interdependent, right? And you need to study both the body and its parts in both anatomy and physiology, right? And also, for both anatomy and physiology, we're going to investigate them using tools, equipment, and imaging. Anatomy must be known for physiology to be understood. And what I mean in terms of this interdependent is that both are going to study the body in some form or another. And both must be understood to understand a living organism. Because again, function is always going to reflect structure. So the physiology is going to depend on the anatomy. What a structure can do depends on its specific form. And this is known as the principle of complementarity of structure and function. So again, anatomy affects the physiology, and physiology is a reflection of the anatomy. If something is wrong with the shape, it's not going to function, right? So that's a really key idea here, this principle of complementarity of structure and function. So again, anatomy must be known for the physiology to be understood, they're interdependent, and function will always reflect structure. Now we're going to look a little more at that complementarity of structure and function. So again, anatomy and physiology are connected because function always reflects structure. The ability of a structure depends on its form. And again, that is our principle of complementarity of structure and function. Throughout this course, as we look at how the human body works, we will also discuss anatomy in order to understand the function of the body part being described. Some structure-function relationships you're going to see are really obvious, whereas some of the other relationships we discussed during this course will be more subtle, but they are still equally important. So for example, I put one here. We're going to talk a little bit about the gastroesophageal reflex. When we eat, food is going to leave our oral cavity and it goes down into our esophagus. From the esophagus, food goes into the stomach, right? When the food arrives in the stomach, you have those gastric juices. They're released to break down the food particles to small enough sizes to be used by the body. These gastric juices do not hurt the lining of the stomach because the stomach has a specific structure that helps the stomach protect itself from these gastric juices, which are very acidic. So food, stomach acid, and other gastric juices must stay in the stomach because between the esophagus and the stomach is a muscle called the esophageal sphincter. So this is that esophageal sphincter right here. So what happens is that a normal healthy sphincter is going to be closed when food is in your stomach. But in some people, due to various reasons, that esophageal sphincter doesn't stay closed. And when it opens, especially if that person ate too much or is lying down, what is in the stomach then moves up into the esophagus. And the esophagus has a very different structure than the stomach. So when the gastric juices get to the esophagus, it hurts. It literally burns and it can cause damage. So because the structure of that sphincter changed from what was normal, then the function of the body's digestive system got disrupted. So again, here you see that sphincter being closed. That's what we want. We want to keep everything in the stomach. But if that sphincter is open, then that allows the gastric juices, your stomach acid, to come back up into the esophagus. And the esophagus is not lined to be able to be protected from those acidic juices coming back up. So that's just one example of how if a structure changes, the function is disrupted. Next, we're going to move on to looking a little bit at the structural organization of the human body and what exactly is needed for humans to survive. So in order for Iron Man here to work at an organismal level, like in other words, to fly around, his most tiny body parts need to work. So at the chemical level, very small atoms are actually the building blocks, right? These molecules are going to merge together to become organelles. Organelles, things like mitochondria. And these organelles are the key components of cells. They are the smallest unit of living things. Cells then join to other cells, and when you have cells joining with other cells, that makes what we call tissues, right? Like the muscle, right? Muscle tissue is a type of tissue. There are 4 different types. Muscle tissue is one, like I just said, also nervous, epithelial, and connective tissue. And each tissue is going to consist of cells of a single specialized type, along with varying amounts of extracellular material. And we're going to talk more about that in a later lecture. Then you can have 2 or more tissues that merge together to create a unique structure called an organ. So that's when you're at the organ level. In this case, the organ that you see here is actually a blood vessel, right? These blood vessels are a component of the organ system known as the cardiovascular system. And that cardiovascular system is going to deliver oxygen, nutrients, hormones, and other important substances to cells and the organs in the body. It plays a very important role in helping the body meet the demands of things like activity exercise and stress. So Iron Man is going to need his cardiovascular system to pump blood, right? Because in the blood is the nutrients that his body takes from the food and the oxygen that's carried on his red blood cells that his organs need to work. So his cardiovascular system is also going to release heat. Sorry, that's a heart, not heat. But it's going to release heat out, right, through the blood near the skin as needed. And a major component of that blood is going to be fluid and water. So you can kind of see here, we went through the structural organization, going from atoms to molecules, organelles, cells, tissues. Then we get to the organ, then the organ system, and then organ systems all function together to allow us to live life, right? So the structural organization of the human body, the anatomy, works in such a way that the human body can function, which is the physiology, so that humans can stay alive. So what exactly are the life requirements or survival needs of humans? Like all complex organisms, humans have many different functions. Some of these functions include things like maintaining boundaries. So the inside of us needs to stay distinct from the outside. Movement, our skeletal system provides that bony framework, and the muscular system is going to propel us from place to place. We also need to be able to respond, so your responsiveness, also known as excitability. This is the ability to sense and respond to changes in the environment. Something we already talked a little bit about is digestion, right? Our bodies need to be able to break down the food we eat in order to get nutrients into the blood that's delivered throughout the body. We also have metabolism, right? That includes all the different chemical reactions that happen in our body cells. We also have excretion, that's a removal of unwanted materials or waste from the body. Reproduction, so that can occur at the cellular level via mitosis, or at the organismal level via meiosis. And then we have growth, which growth is just what it sounds like, right? It is an increase in size in a part of the body or the organism in general. So what do humans really need to survive? Have you ever thought about that? Like at the basic level, what do you need to survive? Well, survival means that we need nutrients. So we need food, right? We need oxygen. If we're not breathing, we're not alive. We need water. You've probably heard how important water is to the functioning of our bodies. And we also need the appropriate body temperature and atmospheric pressure. So if you had food, water, and oxygen, and you were at the bottom of the ocean, you're not going to make it, right? That pressure is going to be too high. Whereas if you have all those things and you're in negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, you're also not going to survive, right? So you need all those different things. We need the nutrients, we need oxygen, we need water, and the appropriate body temperature and atmospheric pressure. So this slide just kind of goes along with what I was just talking about in terms of necessary life functions. Humans are multicellular. So multi means many. So in other words, we're made up of many different cells. We're not single-celled organisms. To function, individual cells must be kept alive. Organ systems are designed to service the cells, and all cells depend on the organ systems to meet their survival needs. So it's really important for us to know and understand the function of each organ system. There are 11 different organ systems that we're going to briefly cover in the next few slides that work together to maintain life. And in this semester, we're going to look at some of these organ systems. And then if you continue on to Phyl 142, you'll cover the rest of those organ systems. Okay, so in this slide and the next slide, we're going to look just very briefly at these different organ systems. Keep in mind, again, this is a very brief overview of each, and we're going to go into much more detail for these organ systems starting in Chapter 5. For now, what I expect you to know is just the names of the systems and the organs and basic functions that are shown in these figures. So first of all, we have the integumentary system. This forms the external body covering, and it protects deeper tissues from injury. Some of the different functions of the integumentary system is to synthesize vitamin D, and also house cutaneous. So when I say cutaneous receptors, I'm meaning things like for pain and pressure. And this system also has sweat and oil glands as well. So some of the major organs are going to be skin, hair, sweat glands, and nails. Next, we have the skeletal system. This is going to protect and support our body's organs, and provide a framework that the muscles are going to use to allow you to move. Blood cells are also formed within bones, and bones are going to store the minerals. So for the skeletal system, you can see the major organs are going to be bones, cartilage, associated ligaments, and bone marrow. And again, it's providing support, also forming our blood cells. Next, we have the muscular system. This allows the manipulation of the environment. It allows locomotion or your movement. It even allows my facial expression. So it also helps you to maintain your posture, right? And it's going to produce heat. So this one's pretty easy in terms of the major organs. It's going to be your skeletal muscles and associated tendons. For the nervous system, this is the very fast-acting control system of the body, and it responds to internal as well as external changes by activating the appropriate muscles and glands. So main organs here are going to be your brain, your spinal cord, and your peripheral nerves and sense organs. So when we talk about the nervous system, we'll talk about how it's divided into two major parts, your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. Then we have the endocrine system. This has glands that secrete hormones that regulate processes such as growth, reproduction, and nutrient use. So in other words, metabolism by our body cells. The organs involved here include the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the pancreas, your adrenal glands, gonads, and endocrine tissues and other systems. And then the last one on this slide is the cardiovascular system that we already talked a little bit about in regards to Iron Man. But this system has your blood vessels that transport blood, which of course carries your oxygen and carbon dioxide, nutrients, and waste. And the heart is going to pump that blood. So the major organs here are your heart, blood, and blood vessels. And on the next slide, we'll continue talking about the rest of the organ systems. Continuing on with the organ systems, the first one that you see in this picture is the lymphatic system. This system is going to pick up fluid that is leaked from blood vessels and it returns it to the blood. So it disposes of debris in the lymphatic stream. So it houses your white blood cells, or in other words, lymphocytes, that are involved in immunity, and that immune response mounts the attack against foreign substances within the body. So obviously a very important system here. The major organs are going to be the spleen, thymus, lymphatic vessels, your lymph nodes, and tonsils if you still have them. Then we have our respiratory system. This is going to keep blood constantly supplied with oxygen, and it also is going to remove carbon dioxide. These exchanges are going to occur through the walls of the air sacs in our lungs. Major organs here are your nasal cavities, your sinuses, your larynx, your trachea, bronchi, lungs, and the very important alveoli. Then we have the digestive system. This is going to break down our food into small molecules that can enter the blood for distribution to our body cells. Indigestible food is going to be eliminated as feces. The major organs here, you can see there's a lot of them, right? It all starts in our oral cavity, so teeth, tongue, then your pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Next is the urinary system. Sometimes you hear this referred to as a different term, but for the purpose of this class, I want you to know this as the urinary system. So it eliminates nitrogenous waste from the body. It regulates water, it regulates your electrolyte levels, and also the acid-base balance of the blood. So this is going to include your kidneys, your ureter, your urinary bladder, and your urethra. Then we have both the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system. So the male reproductive system has the overall function of the production of offspring. Testes are going to produce sperm and male sex hormones, and then the male ducts and glands are going to aid in the delivery of the sperm to the female reproductive tract. The female reproductive system includes ovaries that produce eggs and also female sex hormones. The remaining female structures serve as sites for fertilization and development of the fetus. The mammary glands of female breasts are also going to produce milk to nourish the newborn. So that's kind of a very brief overview of the different organ systems. Like I said, we'll start going into them in more depth later on in the semester. I think Chapter 5 is the first organ system that we cover. But what I want to talk about next is we've been kind of hinting at that these organ systems don't work in isolation, right? I've been talking about how these systems work together. But why do they? What's really the point? The point is to keep us alive, right? And the way they keep us alive is by maintaining a balance. And what is that balance called? You've already done an activity, kind of the name of that activity was this term. So homeostasis, right? That's what we're going to be talking about next. So how exactly do our organ systems work together for our survival needs? Well, our book attempts it with what you see in this figure, right? It shows some of the major organ systems making major contributions to necessary life functions. So you can see here we have our digestive system. It's going to take in nutrients, break them down, and eliminate unabsorbed matter, or that feces, right? And then you can see those nutrients are going to go here into the bloodstream. So the cardiovascular system, this is where the heart is going to be pumping the blood, right? And that blood is going to contain the nutrients from the digestive system. It's also going to contain the oxygen from the respiratory system. And that cardiovascular system is supposed to send those nutrients and oxygen throughout our body to our various organs. We also have our respiratory system eliminating carbon dioxide here. The urinary system is going to be eliminating waste out as urine. And then the nutrients and wastes are going to pass between the blood and the cells via that interstitial fluid. So that part here, your integumentary system, it protects the body as a whole from the external environment. So think your skin, right, as part of that integumentary system. So some of the different organ systems that are represented here include digestive system, cardiovascular system, respiratory system, urinary system, and our integumentary system. But we're missing a lot too, right? We're missing our skeletal system, our muscular system, our nervous system, our endocrine system, lymphatic system, reproductive system. All of our systems are functioning together. And a really easy way to illustrate this is, say, just take one of these systems, our digestive system. If our digestive system doesn't work, we can't get glucose to do any of the energy that our body needs to make our other systems work. So if there's no glucose in our blood, we have no energy to make everything else work here. But when everything's working together, we can go from this, hardly surviving, to being like Iron Man. So next we're going to kind of move on into the second part of this lecture, where we're going to be talking about homeostasis and a little more about the homeostasis activities. So you can see here kind of our learning outcomes. We're going to define homeostasis. We're going to look at the feedback loop and each of the components. Then we're going to compare and contrast the two major types of feedback loops, which are positive and negative feedback loops. We're going to look at an example in the body of both negative and positive feedback loops, and then look at some examples to demonstrate how the body helps to maintain homeostasis. When we look at the concept of homeostasis, remember we have cells that are part of us, right? We are a multicellular organism. And cells in a multicellular organism cannot live and function without other body cells, because most are not in direct contact with the surrounding external environment in which an organism lives. That is known as the external environment. So a single-celled organism, such as, say, an amoeba, is going to obtain nutrients and oxygen directly from its immediate external surroundings, and then it eliminates waste back into these surroundings. A muscle cell or any other cell in a multicellular organism has the same need for life-supporting nutrient and oxygen uptake and waste elimination, but that muscle cell is isolated from that external environment surrounding the body. So how can that muscle cell make vital exchanges with the external environment with which it has no contact? The key is the presence of a watery internal environment known as the internal environment. So life-sustaining exchanges are made through the internal environment. That is the fluid that surrounds the cells. So for this internal environment, the body cells are in contact with a privately maintained internal environment. The intracellular fluid, known as the ICF, is the fluid that is collectively contained within all body cells. The extracellular fluid is a fluid outside of the cells, but it's still inside of the body. And it's made up of two different components: the plasma, which is the fluid portion of the blood, and the interstitial fluid. This surrounds and bathes the cells. So inter means between, and stitial means that which stands. So it's just surrounding, bathing those cells. No matter how remote a cell is from the external environment, it can make life-sustaining exchanges with its surrounding fluid. So particular body systems accomplish the transfer of materials between the external environment and the internal environment, so that the composition of the internal environment is appropriately maintained to support the life and the functioning of the cells. So you will see this as we cover each of the body systems this semester. So here's just kind of a picture to show you. So we have one of these cells in a multicellular organism. We have the extracellular fluid right here that again has two different components: the interstitial fluid and the plasma inside that blood vessel. What we see is that our body systems maintain homeostasis. So body cells can live and function only when the extracellular fluid is compatible with their survival. Chemical composition and the physical state of this internal environment must be maintained within internal limits, within narrow limits. So as I talked about earlier in this lecture, physiology brings into play a lot of the chemical as well as the physical components, right? So we need everything to be within very narrow limits, and it involves that chemical composition and the physical state of the internal environment. So as cells take up nutrients and oxygen from the internal environment, these essential materials must constantly be replenished. Likewise, wastes have to be constantly removed from the internal environment so that they do not reach toxic levels. So homeostasis, this word that I've been talking about over and over, you've already done one part of an activity about homeostasis. Homeostasis is simply the maintenance of a dynamic and relatively stable internal environment. Homeo means similar, and stasis means to stand or stay. So we're keeping similar environment, right? We're keeping things constant. The functions performed by each body system are going to contribute to homeostasis, thereby maintaining within our bodies the environment that is required for the survival and function of all of our cells. And this really is the central theme of physiology, which is illustrated over here in this figure, right? Homeostasis is essential for the survival of each cell, and each cell, through its specialized activities as part of a body system. It helps to maintain that internal environment that's shared by all the cells. So we have our body systems, they're working to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is essential for the survival of the cells, and cells make up the body systems, and it keeps going, right? So again, homeostasis is a very central theme in physiology. You'll hear it multiple times throughout this semester. So we talked about how homeostasis is necessary for our body's function. You might be wondering what parts of our body are controlled by homeostasis. So many factors of the internal environment must be homeostatically maintained. These include the concentration of nutrients. So cells are going to need a constant supply of nutrients for energy production. The concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Cells need oxygen, obviously, to carry out energy-yielding reactions, and the carbon dioxide that is produced during these reactions must be removed from our body. The concentration of waste products, so the end products, like I said, of chemical reactions can have a toxic effect on body cells if those wastes are allowed to accumulate. We also have changes in pH. So changes in pH can adversely affect nerve cell function and also wreak havoc with the enzyme activity of cells. We also need to regulate the concentration of things like water, salt, and other electrolytes. So because the relative concentration of salt and water in the extracellular fluid influence how much water either enters or leaves our cells, these concentrations must be carefully regulated to maintain the proper volume of our cells. We also need to maintain things like volume and pressure. So the circulating component of the internal environment, which is our plasma, must be maintained at an adequate volume and blood pressure to ensure body-wide distribution of this very important link between the external environment and the cells. And last, temperature. So body cells are going to function within a narrow temperature range. If the cells are too cold, functions slow down. If they get too hot, then the structural and enzymatic proteins can be impaired or even destroyed. So all of these different factors are going to be homeostatically regulated. Now that we know what homeostasis is, we are going to explore the regulatory mechanisms by which our bodies react to changes and controls our inner environment. So, what exactly is a homeostatic control system? It is an interconnected network of body components, and it operates to maintain a given factor in the internal environment at a relatively constant optimal level. So we talked about what some of those factors could be in the previous slide, right? We talked about body temperature, volume, pressure, waste level, oxygen level, nutrient level. All those different things are some of those factors that our bodies are going to homeostatically control. To maintain homeostasis, the control system has to be able to do certain things. So it must be able to detect deviations from normal. So it must know what the right normal level is and be able to detect when that changes. To integrate this information with other information, and then also make adjustments to restore the factor to normal. So when we look at homeostatic control, oftentimes it's shown using these feedback loops. That's what these red arrows here are. This is a basic feedback loop. So you have an internal or an external change that is occurring in the environment. The variable is going to be the factor or the event being regulated. So all homeostatic control of variables is going to involve 3 different components that work together to regulate the variable. And that is going to be the receptor, the control center, and the effector. So the receptor is going to be this first part here. It is a sensor that monitors the environment. It's going to respond to changes by sending information or input along the afferent pathway to the second component here, which is the control center. So this is going to be an afferent pathway going to the control center. We'll talk about afferent and efferent more in a little bit. So this next component, the control center, determines the set point. It is, that set point is going to be the level or the range of levels at which a variable is maintained. So it analyzes the input that it receives by comparing it to the set point, and then it determines the appropriate response. Information known as output then flows from the control center over to the appropriate effector. So remember, I told you we're talking just a little bit about the difference between afferent and efferent. So information that is traveling along an afferent pathway here reaches the control center, and the efferent information is then going to leave from the control center and go to the effector. So the effector is then going to carry out the control center's response to the stimulus, and the results of this response then feed back to influence the effect of the stimulus, either reducing it or enhancing it. We're going to look a little more at this on the next slide. So here is kind of a different way of viewing this homeostatic control system. So again, we start with a stimulus. It produces a change in that variable. So maybe we're talking about body temperature, and we see that body temperature being your variable, we see that it drops. The receptor is what's going to actually detect this change. Then it's going to send that input, its information sent along this afferent pathway to the control center. Then the control center is going to send out output, its information sent along this efferent pathway to the effector. Then we have the response of that effector feeds back to reduce the effect of the stimulus and return that variable to the homeostatic level. So again, if we're talking body temperature, it's going to tell our bodies, hey, body temperature is too low, let's bring that back up to get back to that homeostatic level. So again, this is just what we talked about on the previous slide, just a different way of looking at it. So I showed you a basic feedback loop, but if you remember when we went through kind of the key learning outcomes for today, I mentioned that we were going to talk about the difference between negative and positive feedback loops. So in order to stabilize the physiological factor being regulated, homeostatic control systems must be able to detect and resist change. They resist change primarily by operating on the principle of negative feedback. So negative feedback is a type of feedback that is more common. It is going to oppose an initial change, and it is widely used within our bodies to maintain homeostasis. Change in a controlled variable is going to trigger a response that drives that variable in the opposite direction of the initial change, thus opposing that change. So you can see an example shown here deals with blood pressure. So if your blood pressure was to increase, it's going to send that information to the receptors in the carotid, then to the brain, and that's going to decrease your heart rate to hopefully decrease your blood pressure. So that is an example of a negative feedback loop. An example of a hormonal negative feedback loop is the control of your blood sugar by insulin. So receptors can sense increased blood sugar, your blood glucose. The pancreas is a control center in this case, and it's going to secrete insulin into the blood. Insulin is a hormone that causes your body cells or your effectors to absorb more glucose, which decreases your blood glucose levels. So that is negative feedback. So again, negative feedback, just remember that it is opposing an initial change. So we see a change, it's going to cause our body systems to drive that variable in the opposite direction. So if your blood pressure increases, we want to drive that variable to decrease, right? Or if something was to decrease, we want to drive it to increase back up, get back to that homeostatic level. That's negative feedback. Something that is less common is what is termed positive feedback. Positive feedback is where a response actually enhances or exaggerates that original stimulus. So as you can see already, it's the exact opposite of negative feedback. So positive feedback may exhibit a cascade or an amplifying effect as feedback causes that variable to continue in the same direction as the initial change. This usually is going to control very infrequent events that do not require continuous adjustment. So an example that you see here is the example of platelet plug formation and blood clotting. So once a vessel has been damaged, you can see this break or tear in that blood vessel wall, the blood elements called platelets begin to cling to this injured site. And they release chemicals that attract even more platelets. This rapidly growing pileup of platelets is going to temporarily plug that tear, and it's going to initiate the sequence of events that eventually is going to form a clot, right? So that break occurs, the platelets adhere to that site, and they're going to release chemicals that attracts even more platelets there, and that platelet plug is then fully formed. Once it's fully formed, then you no longer need any more platelets there. You have that blood clot in place. So again, this isn't something that's constantly happening, right? We're not constantly tearing our blood vessels. So that's why positive feedback isn't as common as negative feedback, but you can see they're the exact opposite of each other, right? So with negative feedback, we want to oppose a change. With positive feedback, we want to keep enhancing that change. Another very common example of positive feedback that we'll be covering in a few slides is also childbirth, right? Again, not something that happens every day for an individual, but it is an example of positive feedback. So looking a little more in depth here at negative feedback, room temperature, we could think of that as a controlled variable, right? So again, meaning that it is a factor that can vary, but it's generally held within a normal range by a control system. So in this example, the control system would be your thermostat, right? It could be the thermostat, the furnace, all the electrical connections. The room temperature is determined by the activity of the furnace, and the thermometer in that thermostat is going to provide information about the actual room temperature. The thermometer acts as a sensor which monitors the magnitude of that control variable, so it's monitoring the temperature. The thermostat acts as a control center so the thermometer is acting as a sensor. The thermostat is acting as a control center because it compares that sensor's input with the set point, and then it's going to adjust that heat output of the furnace to bring about the appropriate response to oppose a deviation from the set point. So for an example, if that room temperature was to fall below the set point because it's cold outside, the thermostat is going to activate the furnace, which will then produce heat to try to raise the room temperature, right? Once that room temperature reaches back to the set point, that activating mechanism in the thermostat and the furnace are switched off. So this is a negative feedback control system. So we detect a change away from the ideal value of that controlled variable. It initiates mechanisms to correct the situation and then shuts itself off. Homeostatic negative feedback in the human body happens in a very similar way. So for example, when the temperature monitoring nerve cells detect that there is a decrease in body temperature, these sensors signal the temperature control center in our brains and begin a sequence of events that ends in responses, such as shivering. So we're going to be shivering those skeletal muscles and other effectors. We're trying to increase heat production through shivering and other means that will generate heat and raise our temperature to a proper level. When the body temperature then reaches our set point again, these temperature monitoring nerve cells are going to turn off, and the stimulatory signal to the skeletal muscles stops, and our temperature remains stable until we need to initiate another feedback control system to get to the right temperature again. So you can see these are examples of negative feedback, right? Whether it's a temperature in the room controlled by a thermostat and a furnace, or if it's our temperature in our body that's controlled by those temperature monitoring nerve cells and our brain, right? And also our skeletal muscles shivering. We see a similar kind of response. It's also a negative feedback loop if we get too hot, right? So this is all negative feedback. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about positive feedback as well. So in negative feedback, a control system's output is regulated to resist a change so that the control variable is kept at a relatively steady set point. With positive feedback, by contrast, the output enhances or amplifies a change so that that control variable continues to move in the direction of the initial change. Like I said before, this is much less common than negative feedback, but it is important in some instances. So, because the major goal in our body is to maintain stable homeostatic conditions, that's why we see the positive feedback is less common. So positive feedback does play an important role in the birth of a baby. So this is another example of positive feedback. The hormone oxytocin causes very powerful contractions of the uterus. As contractions push that baby against the cervix, the resulting stretching of the cervix triggers a sequence of events that bring about the release of even more oxytocin, which causes stronger contractions, triggering the release of more oxytocin, and so on. And this positive feedback cycle does not stop until the cervix is stretched sufficiently for the baby to be pushed through and born. And then eventually that feedback stops, right? So again, positive feedback is not nearly as common as negative feedback loops, but it is still important in our body systems. So we know that our bodies try to maintain homeostasis, right? But what happens if there's homeostatic imbalance? Well, disruption of homeostasis is going to result in things like internal damage, risk of disease, and changes associated with aging. Disruption causes some sort of damage and it is harmful. And the body fighting back to achieve homeostasis manifests itself in physical symptoms. So if changes are too rapid, it can also be really damaging for the body. So sometimes changes are too great, it's too rapid, our bodies just can't fix it. So physiology is really important for clinical medicine. All health professionals have to be able to comprehend basic physiological principles such as homeostasis to be able to understand what's happening in the body when things go wrong and to determine what needs to be done to correct that situation by whatever means is possible. So physiology is really at the heart of clinical practice. So in terms of this homeostatic imbalance, you've probably heard stories about people who have died of things like anaphylaxis, right? Being allergic to food, and then the body attacks itself, and sometimes that immune response is just too great, and our bodies can't recover from that. You probably heard of other changes, things like diabetes, dehydration, even drinking too much water too quickly, viruses and bacteria, other pathogens. So these are some examples where sometimes our bodies just aren't able to get back into homeostasis. So hopefully in this lecture, you've learned a little bit more about body organization and the importance of homeostasis. So just as a review of what we covered today, so we went over the key questions and learning outcomes at the start of this lecture. Then we had our lecture where we looked at the difference between physiology and anatomy. We looked at how they're connected. We then talked about the organization of our bodies from the tiniest atoms all the way up to the organ system and the organ systems functioning together to give us our organismal level. Then we talked about the different things our bodies need to survive and the various organ systems. And finally, we talked about homeostasis and how we have our negative and positive feedback loops. So hopefully what we learned today in this lecture about homeostasis will help you to complete your second part of your homeostasis activity. So you have two parts of the homeostasis activity. Part one, which you've hopefully already at least started. If not, that's okay. Make sure you go ahead and get that done. And then you also have part two of that homeostasis activity as well. That is all for this lecture. Mahalo for watching.